So welcome everyone. It's very nice to have you all on this live discussion. So this webinar is called Digital Health and Industry. It's a virtual panel discussion. It's been organized by the Digital Health ECR community from the University of Sydney. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campus is stand. We pay our respect to those who have cared and continue to care for the country. So what is the Digital CCR community? So we are a group of people from different research backgrounds that all work in digital health, and our core interest to make sure that everyone's come together in the digital health research, and we're here to support researchers, especially early career researchers in the development of their research career. So it's a new group. We are around 10 people in this group, and every member are in charge of developing an event that will be here to support the members and the early career researchers that are some interest in digital health. So the scale of the seminar, so there will be an opening remark and a discussion for 40-50 minutes. Associate Professor Andrew Campbell will be leading the discussion. At the end, we will have 35 minutes Q&A, so please feel free to put all your discussion in Padlet. Carol will shortly give you a short introduction of how to use Padlet, and we'll be roughly wrapping up the event at 1:30 p.m. Carol, over to you to explain how Padlet works.
Hello, everyone. I have posted in the chat the link to the Padlet, and I hope you can see it. Otherwise, I will just do it again in case someone just join us a little bit later. So if you go to the Padlet, you can see different columns, and there is a column for each panelist today. So if you have a question for one of them specifically, please pick the column, the right one. And then if you have questions for all of them, or you have additional questions, there's one at the very end. We will manage this just to keep the conversation going smoothly. And if you have any question, of course, feel free to reach me through the chat, and I will address your questions or your issues. Thank you.
Before giving over to Andrew, I would like just to do a quick introduction. So Associate Professor Andrew Campbell is a lecturer at the University of Sydney. He teaches digital health, digital mental health. He is a chair and co-founder of the first formal cyberpsychology research group that is part of the biomedical informatics and digital health discipline of the School of Medical Science in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. Associate Professor Andrew Campbell has been working with industry and research for a few years now. So we thought that he would be the perfect person to chair and lead the discussion because he has a good understanding of the two sides of academia and industry. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Audrey. And for those who don't know, Audrey has finished her PhD and has more or less passed. So congratulations to Audrey. A graduate from the Cyberpsychology research group as well, focusing on digital health tools for melanoma and how to give psychosocial support to those who are going through that journey. I'd like to welcome all panelists today. Thank you so much for your time and volunteerism to help what I hope will be the future leaders in digital health come through their programs and learn more about the industry. A little bit of background about today's event to bring together everybody to understand what we are talking about. We wanted to see what PhD students, masters and honours students, and those in their early career stages would want to learn about the digital health industry. And essentially it was a two-part answer. 1/3 wanted to know more about how to do better research to connect and translate their research to industry. Others wanted to know how to work in industry or with industry quite closely. And as you may have heard me say before we started today, I was trying to work out where the other third went. And I think it's a bunch of us that are sitting there going, how does it all work? How do we actually translate research when it's not something that's taught. It's not something that's in our programs. It's something we just sort of organically learn. So that's where a lot of our discussion is going to go today. Your journeys as panelists, how your careers came about, what you're influencing now, and how we can inspire the next generation to join you in the work that you've done. We also asked the panelists, or sorry, we asked the audience today, which of the following topics are they most interested in? Most of the respondents wanted to hear particularly about research translation. So I think they're very interested in innovation. You know, how do we take it to the next step beyond proof of concept and evidence-based practice? So we're going to probably have a lot of questions about that that very early step of how do we reach out to industry? How do you open a conversation with industry to say, I've got a great idea in science, it's working, now what? So with that, what I'd like to do is have each of you introduce yourselves. Once again, if it's okay, you introduced myself before, but if you can do it to the audience now and just tell us what your job is and what you're currently working on perhaps, and what you see is the future for digital health in your sector. Let's start with you, George.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is George Papadopoulos. I have a consulting firm here in Australia called Lucid Health Consulting. We specialise in pricing and reimbursement for the healthcare sector, both pharmaceuticals, medical devices. I think digital health is going to be an interesting part, which I'll get to in a second, from a pricing and reimbursement point of view. My background is pharmacology, epidemiology degrees, and then have moved into very quickly after that to into the industry, pharmaceutical industry, and spent some time here in Australia and overseas in global positions, mostly through pricing and reimbursement and market access, and have been back in Australia. I went overseas for 11 years in the US and Europe, and have come back here in Australia 10 years ago, 2010, and have been in consulting. And we're currently working on reimbursement applications to get drugs on the PBS, medical services devices on the MBS, and also prostheses on the prosthesis list. And in terms of digital health, I think from our perspective, pricing and reimbursement, it's an unknown area, to be honest. There's no funding mechanisms per se set up, public funding mechanisms, but even private. Seems to be digital health remains in the private, out-of-pocket, cash-paying system. So I think there's challenges there from a health technology perspective. What evidence do we require? And also the public reimbursement. So thank you for the opportunity, and yeah, look forward to chatting.
Thank you, George. That's excellent. And I'm absolutely sure there's going to be a lot of people to ask a lot of questions about that specific area that you're talking about too. How is this funded? Michelle, can I invite you to talk about your career, what you're doing right now, and where you see it's going?
Oh, thanks very much. Thank you so much for everybody that made the time to come in today to listen. And I hope you get a lot of value, and please feel welcome to hit me up on LinkedIn. So my name is Michelle Gallaher. I'm Chief Executive of a publicly listed company on the stock exchange called Opyl, and we're solving two problems in the clinical trials industry. One is around recruitment and better access to clinical trials for patients, and the other one is using predictive analytics to improve protocol design or the clinical trial plan design to get better outcomes. And the ultimate goal is to reduce the cost of medical research and healthcare and to make it more accessible. So I guess my background, I started as a clinician in allied health and then moved very quickly into the biotech industry. So most of my career has been working in the industry space. Research actually wasn't an opportunity for allied health clinicians back when I did it 100 years ago. But I often wonder, what if I'd gone down that research path? Would I still end up in the same spot that I'm in now? For us, we're working a lot with natural language processing. And so my background is not in computer science. So I've had to relearn and unlearn and learn a whole lot of new skills around statistics, and in particular around platforms, data, the use of data, and all of the controls around that. So the last I've only built this business over the past 2 years. So a lot of it's been learning in that. A big part of my job is raising capital. and learning how to translate a really great idea, creating the technology or creating the team to take the technology forward, and then finding that commercial outcome for that. So I'm probably more focused in the translation and the commercialization space rather than the creation and the research space. For us, it's a huge opportunity. So COVID has been a really exciting game changer in the clinical trials industry. Now everybody knows what clinical trials are. And in terms of the opportunity and investment in this space, it's a huge market space for us. So we're just at the point in the business where we're now reaching out into the academic sector looking for talent. So it's a sort of different end of the spectrum there. So really excited to be on this panel and to share some ideas and hopefully learn a little bit more too.
Sure, a lot of what you just said resonated, not just with me, but I'm sure with a lot of our audience, about multidisciplinary training. You know, we all started in backgrounds that are very traditional STEM science, and how quickly we realized we didn't know everything we needed to know, and we've had to retrain. I totally relate to what you're saying, as well as the raising of capital and getting the right talent in. I've got 1,000 questions, so I'll come back to you, but thank you, Michelle. That's a wonderful interview, wonderful introduction. David, CSIRO, I'm very curious. So much has happened with CSIRO. Love to know your journey. What's happening now and where to next?
All these people who train clinically and in health science. I actually didn't. I trained in chemistry and computer science and did a PhD combining those two things. And then, you know, as things happen in life, you know, I followed my wife, who had a postdoc overseas, and I followed her and picked up a job in as a programmer in a bioinformatics unit. And we then moved on to the UK, where I worked for the European Bioinformatics Institute. Actually, very briefly, I'd been there about 6 weeks, and my boss said, "I'm spinning out. Do you want to come?" And I went, "I don't know, do I?" And he went, "Yeah, it'd be great." And so I spent 7 years with him building a great business. And then when it was time to come home, I picked up the job in CSIRO in a new digital health research centre, the Australian eHealth Research Centre, that CSIRO was starting with Queensland government, actually, here in Brisbane. And I've been here for the last 17 years and now lead it. So yeah, so we're about almost up to 100 scientists and engineers in the Australian Health Research Centre now, most of which are in about 2/3 of which are in Brisbane. The other third are across Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. We've got 30 or 40 high degree research students as well, some of whom CSIRO doesn't confer degrees. So some of those students, or all of those students, are enrolled through our friends and collaborators at universities, and probably half of them sit here at the sit with our staff and really you know, contribute to our research programs, and then the other half are with our partners in universities, where we provide co-supervision and some of the science and engineering ends up here. So look, very exciting to hear some of the background of the other George and Michelle and some of the other panelists, because I think it shows that, you know, digital health is still in that development phase, a bit like bioinformatics was when I got into it 25 years ago, where we were stealing people from chemistry and physics to kind of get enough workforce to do something serious, whereas bioinformatics now, you know, really is an established science and with lots of jobs around the world. And I think digital health, I'm not convinced digital health will get such a structured career path, because we all do come at it from many different ways, both on the technology side and the clinical side. And that's what I think is unique about digital health, is that you know, as you can see from the panelists today, it really needs a lot of cross-discipline work for us to take a fairly complex system, which is today's health system, and introduce digital technologies in a way that is safe and raises the quality of healthcare which is delivered, and increases the efficiency of that healthcare delivery, so that we can really provide high care quality to all Australians, but, you know, equally all around the world.
absolutely preaching to the choir. Everything you just said is exactly what I've heard myself and others say before. It's such a broad area, digital health, that I think we're under a giant umbrella right now, and we're going to have to build different shelters. But I totally agree with your analysis there, and your background. Bioinformatics in particular, very well established. And it takes that beginning of getting all these different minds together. So just seeing the evolution of bioinformatics to where it is today is, I think, exactly what I think is happening with digital health now. We're starting to see that expertise starting to pair off to the focus groups. Thank you, David. Arthur, zoology. You started your career as the wannabe David Attenborough, the Australian David Attenborough.
Oh, I was
there to now.
I was just thinking about that. Actually, I should go back further than that. I started my career with research experience in industry. Before I went to university, back in the 70s, it was a thing that was done in England back then. You went to do a pre-university year. So I went off and worked for the Shell Oil Company in their agribusiness toxicology laboratory for a year. As a, just out of high school before I even went to uni. And actually that was a really valuable thing to do. I spent a year in what was a pretty large research lab, learning all about good laboratory practice. I was doing gas chromatography, looking for pesticides in soil and things. And that was really valuable, just learning how the importance of control of data and control of protocols and things like that, which was a great foundation for what came much later. It was well before ISO 9001 had been written and all of that sort of stuff, so it was based on some industry codes. And then, I went off to do a biology degree. I did zoology and botany because I knew I wanted to do biology, but I couldn't even figure out if it was plants or animals I was going to do. I went on to do a PhD in biomechanics, which involved some marine ecology. So I learned a great deal about the mechanical relationships between the bite strength of a shore crab and the shell strength of a periwinkle, and realized I couldn't get a job in that. We zoologists were second bottom on the Economist League table of employability. The only people who were worst were the people with primary degrees in philosophy. So then I was lucky enough to do my PhD in Leeds, which was the place which invented the primary Charnley hip implant in the university I was at, and I got to know the orthopedics joint people there and started applying my biomechanics to medical use, and that's where I went off and did postdoc work in materials technology, looking at composites for orthopedics, and spent 10 years as an academic in London originally, and then later in Sydney. I spent a small stint in a startup company and learned about the trials of startups, and worked in one that wasn't well run and fled to the Antipodes as a result, washed up at the University of New South Wales, and worked on biomaterials for medical purposes. I then went on continuing to laboratory work, but this time in government at the TGA. So back in '95, I joined TGA to run the biomaterials engineering laboratories for TGA. But that job also involved regulatory responsibility, setting up the post-market system, what was a very young regulatory program in TGA at that time. So instant reporting, instant investigations, that sort of thing. And then did a stint, as happens in government, you move around. I did a stint as the director of device approval. So I was responsible for signing off high-risk devices, or sometimes recalling them. It's interesting times. And then in 2000, I did two things. I took some long service leave. Bad mistake in the public service. You never take leave because all the knives come out, and they took away my lab and my staff while I was away. And I got a call from University of New South Wales saying, remember those materials you were part of inventing in conjunction with the CSIRO, the chemicals and polymers down in as it was then in Melbourne. And we need to pay you the royalties because we've licensed the technology, and that provided enough money for me to have the confidence to step out of the government and found a consulting firm. I wasn't able to retire just yet, and then did that for the last 20 odd years in medical device regulatory consulting, with quite a fair bit of software devices in that as things developed. So we were responsible for the first artificial intelligence device coming out of Australia, getting the regulatory approval with the FDA. We've done work on next-gen sequencers and the software behind that, a lot of diagnostic stuff, image interpretation, all sorts of stuff. Software has been around in medical devices for a great deal of time, and in fact, is a central component of what is the most dangerous medical device, which is a standard insulin drug infusion pump. Which are software-driven devices, and they've killed people through poor software design and human factors. So, real interest in that, and still am. And I recently retired. I'm not actually sitting on this beach, but I wish I was. Just at the Tonga on the Hawkesbury estuary. But I'm now spending some time with some other startups. Gone back to startup land. One project I'm particularly excited about is with Ellen Medical Devices, which is looking for developing a hardware device which is basically provides clean water locally for use in dialysis. But that device is software driven, and eventually will come with a software app for managing the kidney disease of the patient. So that's my story, as quickly as I can tell it.
Arthur, that is just magnificent. I was thinking to myself while you were going down all these different pathways in your career, that if you were to describe your career as a meal, it was a burger with a lot. It was a burger with a lot. You had so much experience across so many different sectors. And I think that summarizes a lot of what we do in digital health and bioinformatics, is that we start somewhere, we finish somewhere else, but the learning in between is invaluable.
Yeah, the journey is the important part. I'd make one comment for the people starting out, is if you think you've got a grand plan and you're going down that one road, then good luck to you. But the reality is a bit different. Life jumps up and bites you multiple times.
Absolutely.
And what it's about is keeping your eyes open, looking at what's interesting, and taking advantage of the opportunities. I'd never heard of regulatory affairs when I was still figuring out plants and animals.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Arthur. I'm going to throw to our last panelist, Natasha Lazarovic, who is a PhD doctoral student doing what I think is incredibly meaningful work. I will leave it to you, Natasha, if you could summarize what you're doing very quickly, and then we will get into this discussion.
Yes, of course. It was so amazing to hear more about all of you, and I'm so excited to learn from you. And yeah, I'm a PhD student. I work on an interdisciplinary project that incorporates the fields of digital health, anatomy, and machine learning. My project is about applying our understanding of human health to create technologies to monitor our health remotely. And I'm currently working on developing a pregnancy app, which is exciting. I'm also the co-founder of Visibility STEM Africa, which promotes the visibility of Africans in STEM. And my journey to digital health has been quite similar to how everyone discussed their journeys. It was unconventional. I completed an honors degree in cellular immunology, after which I realized I wanted to pursue something more translational, more interdisciplinary, and I was a bit confused what to do then. So I was very lucky that I had amazing mentors and people in my network. So I just reached out and said, hey, I'm not too sure what to do next. Do you have any advice? And from those conversations, an opportunity came up and I grabbed it. I was awarded a summer scholarship to give this interdisciplinary work a go. And I loved it so much that it became my PhD project. So yeah, all I want to say is if you want to try something and you're uncertain, maybe give it a go for a short period of time and see if it suits you. And yeah, just like everyone said, careers are often non-linear. And that shouldn't prevent you from pursuing something that you're passionate about, especially those social pressures. And also don't be afraid to reach out to people. I think all these amazing experienced people on this panel can attest to that. The worst that can happen is someone says no, or they don't respond, but definitely try reaching out. And if you're interested in a career that you're unsure about, ask a person in that career what it's like and maybe have a conversation. So yeah, that's a bit about me, but I'm really excited about this conversation we're about to have.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And your work is very, very much needed, particularly from where you were talking about in coming from Africa and developing nations. I think it's fantastic. I'm going to throw now a couple of questions at you. There's a series of questions that we've got today from the audiences. We're going to have a Q&A later on, but these ones were kind of like the most popular. How do we get to having careers in digital health, particularly with industry and academia? So I'm going to sort of blend two questions together. One, because I'm mindful of the time, but I sort of, when I was reading these, I sort of thought, you know what, there's a lot here to unpack. And really one of them, or these two questions I'm putting together, were kind of the same thing, but said in different ways. So the question to the panel is this, and I really ask for any panelist to jump in and respond. So just unmute yourself and start talking. And if we start all getting excited, I'll start calling out names. But the participants today, well, participants here, I'm talking like a researcher again, the audience today would like to know why digital health translation is actually important. Why we don't keep it theoretical. Why is it now the time that we start bringing it into industry? And I think it's pretty self-evident with the pandemic side of things, but that brings in the second part of the question is, how do we translate it into industry? How does science, or how do scientists reach out to industry and say, hey, I've got an idea, I want to work with you and get it out to the masses? Anybody like to kick off? Michelle.
I'll jump in. It's really interesting. So I just got off a phone call literally only a few minutes before this panel started. And it was a tremendous young woman who was in Sydney who had seen me speak at an event just like this. And first of all, she connected to me on LinkedIn. That's why I said that at the start of what I introduced myself. But she's been working in a research space. She's an early career postdoc. And because she'd heard me speak about what my research challenges were in translation, she began the conversation. And I have to say, this is the first time that's happened in my 25-year career that I've had an academic reach out to me proactively and say, hey, Michelle, I heard you speak at this thing. I hear you're trying to solve a problem in clinical trials. I might have a solution. Now that to me sounds ludicrous, that surely that doesn't happen. And maybe it's to do with the culture, I think, maybe in academia, or maybe it's about confidence, maybe it's about accessibility. But I think in terms of the translation, why translate this into a clinical setting? I genuinely believe that there is no researcher out there that is genuinely doing something, particularly in the healthcare sector, that doesn't want to make a difference to people's lives. So it's a bridge that just really has to be crossed, and not everything is translatable. But on the flip side, particularly working as a clinician, there are so many issues in the healthcare space. I came from an ophthalmology background in which as soon as my brain was switched on to, I actually don't like the tools in my toolbox sitting in front of me in a clinical setting. What if we had different tools? So I think there's a real pull from clinicians in wanting to solve problems in different ways. It's about bringing that together. I think how to translate in industry, how to translate that is actually, it's difficult, and it's not a one size fits all sort of approach. But I certainly feel that it's not always a funding problem, and we often go to saying, well, there's just not enough money. I don't believe that. I think, yes, there's an access problem. How do you find the right people to partner with, and what's the structures around that? But also, I think there's a real problem in really understanding the problems that need to be solved in a clinical space, and instead of doing technology fit, you know, really understanding the problem space. I think, yeah, over to you, George. I'm going to point to you.
That's all right. I was just answering one of a question in the Padlet, so, but I was listening. So just to remind everyone, there's the Padlet. They can ask you specific questions, which it was anonymous, but I will get to that person's question. But, you know, I think, so I think reaching out to, in terms of the digital space, I'll go back to what my beef is, or what my area is, and it relates a little bit to the question that was in the Padlet too, is that I think it's not a pillar of our medicines policy, and and I think the way we think about medicines is very limited at the moment. So I think it needs to be expanded exactly what a medicine is. And I think, and I'm going a little bit off the first question there, because I think the reason digital health specifically is it's much more of a 21st century thing, and how do we think about health from a digital perspective, and digital can encompass a lot of different things. So I think from the researcher's point of view, I think they need to kind of think about also reaching out about who's going to access it. And I'll go back to my expertise of reimbursement and payment, because it's all good to do the trials and the basic research, but I think we need to have an end game in sight, and that's people like me and you. I mean, we're all consumers, we're all patients. Is how are we going to access it? And then is it something that's going to be paid for by us out of pocket, which seems to be a lot of the space is at the moment? Or is it something that's much more of a public health issue that should be funded from a public healthcare system? And then also, how does private healthcare play into that? Because they're sort of, I think, also an interested stakeholder. So for the people on the call, I think the opportunity is that there's multiple stakeholders that you can go to, but you need to think about where you want your technology to play. I might just stop there.
I think that's an excellent point, and it resonates from my own career experience where I've worked with both private NGO, which is basically charity organizations, and I've also worked with the public sector. And it's about what do they want? How do they work with their market? And that's something I think most scientists don't think about, is the market itself, like who is the person that's working to translate it into the market. David, can I ask you from a CSIRO point of view and from your previous experience, how does CSIRO move to privatization of technology, or how do we get the innovations that are coming out of CSIRO into practical use? And then as you were talking, and I want to touch on the point of getting the researchers trained to do this work as well. So it sounds like there's a bit of a hybrid model going there.
Yeah, so look, a couple of points from me. One is that digital health is a bit of a misnomer, and we need to be thinking health. So you know, whatever we're doing with digital technologies, what we're really trying to do is solve a health problem. And so from that point of view, you know, who wants it, who are the customers, understanding the market, you know, once you've kind of put that frame on it, it's not so different to any other, you know, thing you might want to take to market. And so, you know, I guess from a CSIRO point of view, anytime we look at translation, you know, they're the sorts of questions we ask. What is important, something Michelle touched on, and I think George also, is that you need to understand the health system, and you need to work with the health system. So it's not just finding someone to commercialize. It's like, you know, if you kind of have done something, you know, developed something or something, and then you're looking for how you translate it, you've almost too late. You know, you need to be identifying the problem and working with the health system on the, you know, during the whole research. And that is what we do here at in the research program I lead within CSIRO, is that we work very closely with industry and government, and in particular the health sector, so that we know that you know, it's not a technology push. It is us working with the health system to understand how we might, you know, what we might develop and how we might trial it and build the evidence base for that digital transformation. And the system is translating with or without us academics and researchers. The health system is spending huge amounts of money to implement digital technologies to make the system more efficient and to deliver services. So there's heaps of opportunities. They do tend to go big, and, you know, big by an American electronic medical record system for hospitals, but that's, you know, that is how the health system's working. So you know, that's where, you know, you need to be working with the health, you know, whoever's local or your state health department, or the GPs or whatever, to see how you fit in and how your innovation, which may or may not include a really high-tech digital solution, might be something else, how your innovation helps deliver health services. So and the final thing I'll say is, because I did touch on electronic data and electronic medical records, there are real standards in digital health for data and interoperability and things like that. Making sure that you align with those eases the path into the digital health market, but also helps down the line with things like regulatory approval and economic, the kind of economics and reimbursement models as well. So there's just a few thoughts from me, a little all over the place.
No, all very relevant. What's occurring to me right now as we're having this discussion is there's so much to unpack. It feels like we're dealing with a wild octopus. There's so many arms that we've got to control. Can't help but bring the zoology into it, Arthur. Arthur, from your point of view, translation, you've done startup. Can we talk about startups?
Yeah, I was about to. Before I answer the question, can I just make an observation on something George had said and talk about the crazy times we now live in, that there are a bunch of opportunities coming out of the crazy times we now live in. The digital health has had some traction on reimbursement, George. The Commonwealth had resisted for years paying GP reimbursements for telemedicine consultations. They were introduced as an emergency measure, and they've now been made permanent because they realized that the sky didn't fall in if you spoke to your doctor over Zoom rather than going to surgery.
And it didn't get their budget.
There's a whole lot of emergency use applications went through, and again, we've realized the sky didn't fall in, but maybe there's other ways of doing regulation. So I just want to make that observation. Coming back to your question, I'd like to put things this way. I've jumped around between universities, startups, government, whatever. I'm sure everybody understands here that the perception of the difference between those sectors are really mythological. I've seen some really crappy research done in universities, some Nobel Prize winning research done in universities. When I worked in that pesticides lab, that little lab in Shell Research published papers in Nature on the persistence of pesticides and their transmission through the birds in the Arctic. They did incredible research. When I've done work in consulting, working with big drug companies, I had the good fortune to spend some time with the AstraZeneca research facility in Alderley, which now moved to Cambridge. It's like a whole university campus doing incredibly high-level research in oncology drugs, done in the private sector, as good as anything done in the leading uni labs. And I've seen little startup companies, one I worked with in Sydney, developing a heart assist device, doing extraordinary engineering research on the smell of an oily rag with half a dozen people in a little industrial unit in St. Leonard's. Research happens in all sorts of environments, is my point. And so if you're sitting in a university, don't think that you've got to stay in a uni to do research, and you move between them. Secondly, what is translation about? And I think a couple of people have already alluded, David and Michelle have alluded to the idea of, solutions and problems and where they come from. And it's great to hear, Michelle, that somebody rang up and said, I've got a solution to a problem they'd heard about, because unfortunately, all too often, academics have got a solution looking for a problem, and it needs to be the other way around. And what I think is needed, and it's always been needed and it always ever will be, is for the different players to have better understanding of what each of them can bring to the table. In the digital health space, medical devices are quicker than medicines. Digital medical products are quicker than medical devices because there's so few overheads in development of the things. And you look at the number of medical apps around, and about 99.9% of them are totally useless, and that 0.1% are game changing. We've got to learn to talk to each other and to understand what each can bring. So that's a bit of a rambling answer to your question, but that's
no, that's fine. I think we're getting a really lovely summary here of the fact that we are trying to work all on the same page, but we often look at different aspects of the page. And I think that's really good to sort of break that wall down, saying there are opportunities everywhere, but we have to understand both sides of the fence, whether it be a consumer, a problem, or an economic.
Yeah, I'd add one other thing. When you're doing the research in the private sector, it tends to be far more driven and focused on an identified problem.
Yes, yeah.
Whereas university research can often be less directed, and that's not a bad thing. If we didn't have that undirected research, we'd never have had the silicon chip.
True.
You know, we'd have never discovered antibiotics, etc. So you know, there's all those stories.
Accidents happen to the benefit of us. I think it's a beautiful segue. I'm going to throw it to Natasha here because you are developing an app, and in your work, if we were looking at its application in industry, what have you found difficult in getting that sort of connection happening? Because here you are on limited resources as a student, developing an app, working away on it to refine its evidence base, and going to Arthur's point, I cannot agree strongly enough on how many rubbish apps are out there for medical, and in my industry, mental health. They are just, I've got this idea, I'll make an app and I'll tell you it does this. How are you finding that your research is being taken seriously to be translated, or are you having barriers to its translation so far?
That is such a good question, and definitely have had a lot of challenges. But I first, instead of responding to that, I just want to mention what Arthur said about having a team. The only reason I've been able to come this far is because the team I'm working with is driven and wants to see some sort of translation. And as well, you have to be passionate about what you're doing and believe in what you're doing. And you need to, I guess, persevere through all those challenges, because you're always going to be faced with challenges in this process. So what we started with, we were dreaming big. So we're like, let's apply for all these big funding grants like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then we were like, oh, okay, actually, no, let's try to approach it, I guess, in a more feasible manner to start applying for more internal grants, because we're in a position where we still don't have a beta version of the technology we're developing. So we're developing this software that can monitor pregnant women's bodies, right? And we don't have the preliminary results. When you're in that position to find support, it's very difficult. So the way we approached it was an internal grant, and the university has this commercial development and industry partnership fund. So that's something that we recently applied for, so we can run a pilot study to get preliminary results. So then we can present those preliminary results as a proof of concept. But without a proof of concept, I'd really love to hear from the other panelists. What do you do in terms of a technology? And another thing I had to consider as a student is if you then go and apply for something like this at university and apply for intellectual property, the intellectual property is now owned by the university. So as a student, you lose that. So I didn't even know about any of this. And I was like, wait, so I'm losing ownership of this technology that we're building. So that's also something to consider. But the benefit of that is that you do have the support. And also, with the Visibility STEM Africa work I do, I'm part of the incubator program at the University of Luxembourg. And the benefit of having the university's support, for one, is to give you those tools that you are not trained on in terms of commercialization, how to pitch, for instance. So one thing I had to learn the hard way is pitching to people in finance and realizing, actually, I don't need to spend so much time talking about the evidence-based value in what I'm doing. I need to spend more time talking about its sustainability or scalability. But no one told me that until I did it. Another example was when I talked to a healthcare professional, and I needed to change the way I spoke about machine learning, for instance. So I needed to be very careful about how I phrased how this app would help them, instead of you know, making them feel like perhaps it would replace the care that they're giving. You need to say words like, it will assist them in providing care. With machine learning as well, you don't want to make all these promises like, we will be able to predict this and prevent all of these adverse outcomes. And I learned that through experience, of course, and making mistakes, that perhaps saying, we may project these adverse outcomes, or the risk of these adverse outcomes. So yeah, so I learned through experience, and I found that having the support, especially to start, is helpful, but you do have to consider what then happens to the intellectual property. So yeah, that was my experience.
Actually, what you just said in the last few minutes summed up the first 10 years of my career. It was a case of, I had all these wonderful ideas. There was an IP problem. In one case, I got funded, and the university then stopped it going ahead because they didn't get enough of the IP percentage. The partner that we worked with said, look, we can't work with the university because they're inflexible. And then there was the other issue around the language of translating evidence base into what does that really mean for a consumer and a company. So you had a different vernacular you had to learn. This leads to a beautiful segue to the main question that we're going to ask today, which is, how do scientists come to industry, and what is the tips, or not so much how they come to, but what are the tips that the panelists can provide to help people get their message of their idea, their solution, and how to work with industry? So in other words, what's the pitch? What's the advice you can give a young researcher for making that first phone call, making the impact, getting the conversation going that meets that everybody says, I see you're on the same page? I really want to hear your own personal experiences or experiences you've had in mentoring others, because this is really what the PhD sector is about, particularly for bioinformatics and digital health now. How do we connect the two? Because we're not trained in the vernacular. We're not trained in customer service. We're not trained in all of that. So what advice can you give? I'll go backwards this time. Can I start with Arthur, and I'll do David, Michelle, and George.
Thank you.
Sorry, can you just summarize that? I was in the middle of typing a response to that. I wasn't listening fully.
We're really looking at a practical approach here. If a young researcher comes to you, what advice could you give them on what would give them the best opportunity to partner for either a startup or an industry solution?
Yeah. When you're talking about partnering with an existing company rather than starting your own. Yeah, I think if you're going to partner, you really, to Natasha's earlier comments, you've got to have something that's developed well enough. Partnering isn't going to happen unless you've got something that's sufficiently mature that a big firm or an established firm is going to take it on. So you need to ask yourself the hard questions: are you there yet? Or do you do what Natasha did and go back to the drawing board and go and seek some additional funding to develop it to that point?
Very good point. And I've found with my own work in cyberpsych that it's very hard to develop, as Natasha's found, if we don't have the resources inside the university. I think David said before, if you fund out of your own pocket and you start getting things up, when's the point? No, it was actually George that said it. Sorry, George, you said about funding for yourself. I think the question then is that if partnership is the harder route, what's the new route, or what's the initial route for an early career PhD to come out and say, I want to work for you, I've got the skill sets that you need?
Oh, in terms of just going and seeking employment. Yeah, let me tell you an anecdote about hiring in my last company. I have a visiting position at Sydney Uni. I'm a visiting prof in the biomedical engineering, and I used to teach a full unit of study until recently there in Reg Affairs. And I did that as a volunteer, and I did it for entirely selfish reasons. And that was that it was a 13-week-long interview program. So I'd get to cherry pick what I thought were the best students every year and try and hire them into the firm. That worked kind of well, but the last round of, not the last, but recent round of recruitment, we had a couple of positions available, and I got applications from that year's cohort of students. And the really high flyers, which I'd identify as high flyers, were really being difficult. They were all waiting on the best job offer from ResMed or Cochlear, or they might go and do an international program. They didn't want to commit. And then there was one other student who didn't come from wealthy family on the North Shore with daddy wanting to fund them to go off on an international volunteering program or whatever, was just an ordinary, you know, run-of-the-mill student that wouldn't have normally attracted attention. But that student was keen, kept chasing me, showed that they'd thought about the job, and that was the one we hired. It was the individual who'd really thought about what they were going to contribute. It's not about how wonderful you are, it's about what you are going to do for the employer, and thinking about it that way. And so, you know, if you're going down that road of seeking employment, ask yourself those sorts of questions. It's not about your science and how great you are. It's about what are you going to bring to the employer? What's your value, and are you really committed? And this student showed they were.
No,
and in fact was one of the most successful hires we've ever had.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you, Arthur. That answers it beautifully. David, what would attract you to a new researcher?
On mute.
You're just on mute.
Something I alluded to earlier was that you know, we still are very short on digital health expertise in Australia, and so this is a huge market where we continue to need to train the next generation of digital health people coming through, and you know, we've seen IT students continue to come out of IT and go into finance and resources and lots of other areas and not come into health. And so we've actually partnered with the University of Queensland to introduce a third-year IT course on digital health, so that we're actually are training, you know, I think we've got 35 third years enrolled this year, and a bit like George was just talking to, we certainly look at them as potential future hires. Not that we've had a lot of luck there, and we've had some great students through, and there's some very bright students coming through. So if we can start to capture them into digital health, I think that'd be great. I agree with George that, you know, it's that hunger to be involved. And to be honest, Graham Grieve, who is a digital health luminary from Melbourne and invented the FHIR data standard, which is now underpinning health, digital health all around the world, had a recent conversation with him where he said, you know, David, this is, and he was talking about FHIR itself, and he said, look, this is modern computer science, and it's there are well-paying jobs, and you know, there's a real social imperative for people to be working in this area. Why isn't this the sexiest job going? In, you know, for really bright IT students coming out of university, and for bright researchers. So I think somehow we have to make it a bit sexier for them, or I actually suspect it's just raising the profile that there is a real need, and that's a potentially, you know, a university, but also a health system challenge. You know, because it's the health system which really needs more digital health expertise and many more workers in this space. So when it comes to, you know, putting your best foot forward, I think, you know, we've talked about some of the things in having a good solution. There's nothing like you know, partnering with the right people, identify who has the problem and how you can fill that problem. And so, you know, go early. You know, most clinicians, if you're, you know, there's a lot of clinicians in the health service, there'll always be someone who's willing to work with a young researcher with a good idea. And there's increasingly a number of different ways where you can build prototypes and things. Don't just think about, you know, having to, you know, get money and build a prototype with someone. You know, we in our digital health course with the University of Queensland, we have the students form groups and build a Smart on FHIR app as part of their course, and we go out to hospitals and partners and look for you know, clinical mentors who have got an idea and want a prototype built. And once you've got a prototype which you can show people, then you're starting to get interest, and that's how you start to raise that funding. So there's lots of different ways to get a prototype built these days. How's that?
I use a similar technique in one of my classes where we get them to do a sort of a concept, and then from the concept we look at how we can build it in-house and show people and so on. So I think that's a fantastic suggestion. Michelle and then George, and then we're going to have one more question for the panel, and then we're going to throw to Q&A. So Michelle, just to revisit the question, we're looking at what would attract you, particularly you're a CEO, what would attract you to new talent? How does a young researcher approach you to say, I'm in?
Yeah, just on LinkedIn. That's it. No, that's not true. Can I be really practical here? You know, as a chief executive looking for technology and talent, I find it really hard to find it. And so I would say to early career researchers, be active on social media. So it's the one place that I spend a lot of time is actually on Twitter. And I'm reading really widely in that space. And if you get retweeted by a digital health CRC or by you know, an ARC training centre or something like that, I'm likely to see it. And the same on LinkedIn. I think the other thing is use the accelerators. It was really great, Natasha, to hear you say that you've been part of an international accelerator. So I sit on the board of the Actuator, and we see about 60 companies, many of them in digital health, that come through. And I know that anybody that's been through an accelerator has the business skills and the language that I'll respond to. So that's where I see most of the talent, and often I'll look at particularly startups in the space and go, yeah, I actually think there's an opportunity here to merge that idea with something over here. And often I'll make the connection between those two people in that sector. I think the other thing is to really focus on speaking opportunities and be proactive. Don't wait for people to ask you to speak at a conference. And I say this to all of the young people that I mentor out there, have a little document like a 200-word bio that really articulates the areas of expertise that you can speak on, that really reflects your research and the solution opportunity that industry would be interested to hear. Having, you know, worked in an industry association some years ago, this was my biggest problem, was finding really high quality speakers, but finding those niche areas that the industry should be hearing about. So it very rarely happened where people would come to me and say, Michelle, I've got this really great idea for an industry lunch or a webinar or something like that. The other thing is to make friends with the translation people in your university or research institute, because those people have great networks. And so they often cross over universities and institutes in that way. It's not papers that I read. I don't look at patents, and I don't look at papers published. I don't have time for that sort of thing. I also look at my investor network, so the people that are giving me money or the people that I'm pitching to, because they often horizon scan as well. So there's quite a bit of chit chat. So I know it's really hard to make contacts in that space, but I hope that's kind of fairly practical advice. The other final point I want to make is when I first started my business, I didn't turn to academia to find collaborators or even to build my MVP. I turned to other SMEs. And so they're really easy to work for and with, and they've got a lot of PhD talent inside those SMEs. So have a look at the consulting firms and highlighting, you know, some of the firms that I think are really great spaces, particularly early on in your career, are the bigger ones. So think of Planet Innovation, Hydrix, you know, think of also the big management consulting firms like Deloitte and EY and PwC. They all have great digital health teams. And you would be learning the language and creating the experience and building that professional network. So sometimes it's about putting your technology idea and sticking it in your back pocket for a year or two, and then going into some of these roles to take, it's a bit of a diagonal step, but it's learning those skills and experiences and then bringing them back into your own research agenda.
Jill, that was fantastic. That answers a lot of what I know is a lot of people watching today, but also people that aren't watching today that have asked questions of me of what are the practicalities, and you just gave some absolute pearlers. Thank you. George, your experience, what attracts talent for you, and what could you give as an advice of how to basically add on to what Michelle just said?
I was about to say, I'll just copy and paste, which is not a bad strategy sometimes. You know, you can't invent everything. I'll just start from there, that you can't invent everything from scratch. A lot of it's been done. And I think just to follow up on what Michelle said, I think I'm also a big believer that the network, you've got to think of your network as short-term, medium-term, long-term, and it can come and go. And I think you shouldn't undervalue connections you can make through LinkedIn. I'm a big fan of LinkedIn, social media, sometimes just even a text message or a phone call. But I think those connections, you can't just think I need something today or now, because you may have something in your mind that person may not see the value. You've done your 1 page or 30-second elevator pitch or 10-second elevator pitch, and there may not be something there. And also the thing about network and connections is it takes a lot of time and effort. And even what we're doing here today, we're all volunteering our time and effort to pay it back, but also make new connections and so forth. And it's not always monetized is the other thing. And, as a pricing and reimbursement person, that might be anathema to what people say, but what people forget about is the third part of what we talk about in pricing and reimbursement, and that's value. Like what is the value of something? Because that's different from the price and or the cost. And I think when, back to the original question, when I'm looking at people coming to join us in the consulting firm, and we've invested in some products as well, it's what will make it valuable to us. And because you're willing to pay, and your willingness to pay will come, but it's what's valued to you. And so I think echoing everything that everybody else has said, don't be afraid to go to the industry association meetings, and there's a lot of them around. Talk to people, make yourself known, and I'll echo Michelle and Arthur, who's there, as being on boards of ARCS and Oz Biotech and so forth. Having your name out there and presenting, even for a 10-minute presentation on your technology or your solution, or even telling people about your problem. Don't be afraid to tell people about your problems, because you may not know what the solution is. So you have the problem, and so other people may be working on it. And I'll just finish off by saying that as you exit the universities and exit academia, your network doesn't have to be just in that space, and you can reach out to people. And don't forget also that there's also connections and networks, but it really doesn't hurt to have mentors, and you can have 1 or 2 or 3. You don't just have this, this all-knowing mentor that knows everything, but there's more than one mentor to have out there. And I think if you polled everybody from the panelists, we've all got people we've turned to for advice and so forth. And you may not know their mentors, but after 20 years of asking the same person a bunch of different questions, you realize actually they are a mentor. You don't normally go up to someone and say, can you be my mentor? That's not how it works. It's those relationships and going back to that same person. And I might just end it there.
No, very good advice. I have one question to ask the panel, but I think it's going to be one of those questions that it's a case of I know this or I don't know that. And the question that academics ask themselves all the time, and George, you alluded to this about not just networks, but funding. We are trained in the university sector to look at the national schemes of funding, whether it be NHMRC or ARC. One of the things we know in digital health and bioinformatics and anything to do with this new area that we're all working, which is very multidisciplinary, is that funding is drying up from governments on one hand. On one hand, they're wanting new innovations, but they're looking at the private sector to fund those innovations. From your experience, what would be a good place to start looking for funding if they're moving out of academia? I'll throw that one open, whoever wants to answer that, because it's really a case of this is where people need to know what is a startup, or here's a seed fund, or here's an organization that may help you with your product.
I'll just make a general comment. Funding has been drying up for 40 years. You know, I hear conversations at Biotech all the time about how funding is drying up for the commercial sector, and it's all being piped into academia. So you know, but the point is look widely, because as you just said, Andrew, you know, there's private sector funding, there's VC funding, there's grants, there's internal grants in the university. You've got to scratch around from wherever you can go. And again, your value proposition, have you got a compelling story, is what's going to really drive whether you get funded or not.
Yeah, I largely agree. I agree that funding's been drying up for 40 years, and it changes, and so you know you need to be agile and be looking around for where you can get the resources, and it may not be, you know, traditional funding. And I think it's George who earlier said that you know, industry does fabulous research, and so, you know, looking for those opportunities, it may be a job, you know, where they want to, you know, take your idea, and they've got an idea and they're saying, well, let's do it together. And you know, and you may not end up owning the IP, but you may end up with, you know, the company investing in you and your idea, and that you build a career and you build a product within a company. So and in some ways that's a lot more sustainable and a lot less risky. So I think there's just a plethora of different ways. I do think that you know, going through the commercial sector, you know, there's lots of opportunities these days. Government is looking to save money on and have services coming through, and that's where the reimbursement models and things like that will come through. So you know, just be open to all sorts of ideas and all sorts of opportunities.
Can I maybe jump in there? One of the big lessons that I learned fairly early on, and it was a hard lesson, is I thought I had a great technology in a previous business, and I thought, yeah, the pharmaceutical industry would be gagging for this. I didn't do my research, and I didn't understand what the business priorities were for the companies that I was approaching, and that was a really hard lesson. I probably wasted a whole year in this space and ended up dropping the technology and realizing, yeah, I thought it was a great idea. There was a clear unmet need. I had the technology solution, but I actually had no natural acquirer. So there was no one in industry that really felt the urgency around the problem that I was highlighting, or it just wasn't a priority at that time. The other thing is too, I've seen some companies, particularly some startups, do a really great job in crowdfunding. So don't dismiss this, even though it's relatively small numbers, and a lot of them start off with 15,000 or 25,000. But then if they add that to maybe a pitch competition that they've run, which gives them $50,000, then they're away. I think my other bit of advice is think about not just money in terms of getting off the ground, think about platforms. So this could be, you could build your idea within a job, within a company. Yep. That's what we're doing at the moment. So we're hoping to bring in a particular academic that I've been stalking on social media for about 2 years, to bring this young person into the business through a job, but also giving that person the opportunity to grow their technology. And the outcome might be that we may spin that out. Or maybe that person doesn't want to do that. They just want to be able to pay it forward and leverage it through the company. That's sort of a different opportunity. But I actually think government money is very, very expensive money. And so if you're applying for a grant, you know, buckle up, because it's going to cost you an arm and a leg in emotional sweat and tears. And also government money forces you into particular priority buckets. So I'm very famous in my business for looking at a government funding opportunity and going, nah. So and the team is so frustrated because I constantly say no to government money because it's very, very expensive, and you get forced into a reporting guideline that chews up half of your time, slows you down.
Also, I can't help but notice so many heads nodding right now.
Why do you think I left academia? Because you're constantly after government money to pay your money.
I mean, all of my grants throughout my career have actually been industry grants. I've not done an HMRC. I'm not done an RC. I'm constantly pushed towards that direction, but I agree with you, Michelle. I try to keep it simple.
But it's certainly what we've found in our business, Opyl. So we've just done 2 capital raises during COVID, and we're tiny. We're like a micro nano zip cap. We're so tiny on the stock exchange. But each time we've gone out to raise money, because we've been able to really articulate the problem we're trying to solve and prove that we have a natural acquirer, that we've been able to raise money actually quite easily. And so each time we've gone out, and I hope this doesn't sound like sort of boasting because I'm
no, not at all. No.
But each time we've gone out to raise capital, we've been oversubscribed by a quantum of 5 to 7 times.
Oh, wow.
The stock exchange prevents us from taking that money because we're so small. But then the next gap for me is sort of, and it's kind of like I call it the bridge too far. And that is, most of the people that want to invest in digital health need to invest maybe a minimum of $10 million. So I'm nowhere near that. I'm nowhere near that opportunity at the moment. So I have this gap in funding. I've got lots of people that want to invest, you know, $300,000 or $500,000 or maybe even $1 million. But the next quantum for me is people that need to invest 40 million or they can't invest.
Yeah.
So for me, it's interesting, but certainly what I'm hearing from the investment community is this huge appetite for digital health. It's got much sooner value creation points than medtech or small molecules or anything like that. There's a real need for it, particularly anything that can address the remote or any workplace security or sustainability efforts. And so we're in this beautiful space right now, and I think it's true that a lot of investment money out there in big business is looking to flow somewhere because they're not putting their money into food or supply chain issues. They're not putting their money into property because that's a bit of a closed market. They're looking at something that's global, that's scalable, really important point, and one that has a revenue point that is within, 12 months to 2 years and not much longer than that.
That's invaluable. George, any further? I feel bad that you come up with just copy and great answers.
I'll just copy and paste again.
Copy and paste again. Yeah.
I'm a big believer. You know what? I'll just say one extra thing, and just Michelle said it, but I'll expand on it. Is we've also gone down the path of having the next big solution for the pharmaceutical industry. We thought we had it all solved, and it was a great platform. And we went out to get the partnership. We visited all the top 20 companies in Australia, knocked on doors and said, this is the next big solution for you. And to be honest, the lesson for us was they didn't want it. And, we sat down and looked at why. And I think the lesson for us was don't keep pursuing it. Like it was our baby. We spent a year creating it. We thought it was going to solve so many issues and problems. But then we've sat down and we let it go. And I think letting that go at the right time is also something you need to learn and experience, or just do it.
Yeah.
And not fail at it, but just
no.
It's not that you failed, but it's just that it's not the solution. It's no one wants it. No one wants to pay for it. You thought you had it. And I think you need to kind of, again, these are all cliches, but you do need to move on. It's not it's not it. And, you step on to the next issue or solution. So it's and the corollary to that is there will be a story where someone's spent 20 years and it will come to fruition, and that's fine. But I think a lesson to learn and not to be afraid is to step away. And you weren't right, and I wasn't.
Yeah.
We weren't.
Validating an invention or solution is really important and really hard to do.
Yeah.
And I learned fairly early, back when I was in the UK, working with an orthopedic surgeon who got some new idea for fixing long bone fractures. And I was advised, it was very good advice, go and talk to other people in the orthopedic profession, other surgeons who do things in the traditional way, just go and show them this idea and ask them what they think of it. Don't just listen to the clinician inventor who's very evangelical about it. And we did that. I went off to find a couple of people in the orthopedic college, and they absolutely panned it and told me the 10 reasons why it was never going to work. Which just had not surfaced until we did that. So, if you've got a clinician involved particularly, but not just if you've got a clinician, go and talk to other people in the field, and preferably find the people who you think are going to hate this anyway, because you'll get really valuable insight from them.
You do, yeah.
They'll be biased as well, but it will validate what you do.
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to thank all of you for being super genuine about your experiences, because I find that we always portray this persona, especially on LinkedIn, for example, all those posts about, I went through this and that and all the success stories, but I think we should also be more open about the challenges that we face. And I just really like what we're talking about, not making assumptions about our end users. And part of what I'm doing now is interviewing and surveying my end users to make sure that what I'm doing actually aligns with what the industry needs are. And if my end users would even want to use what I'm building. So yeah, I just wanted to add that, just to thank you all for being super genuine. It really makes a difference to everyone here.
Can I add one more comment, Andrew? Sorry for jumping in again. What you just said about surveying your users and what have you. I was struck earlier. I think Michelle, you talked about industry associations. Quick anecdote from the ARCS conference that happened a couple of weeks ago. We at ARCS were crazy enough to have a face-to-face conference and managed to slip it in between lockdowns. It was wonderful. There was a young fellow turned up to that conference who was a student who really wanted to break into the clinical trials industry, and he'd been smart enough to go and get himself a volunteer appointment at the conference. So he worked on the front desk and stuff, and then got himself in and spent his time going around the exhibition, talking to people and asking questions and introducing, saying, this is what I want to know. I'm not really sure about it, but I want to learn, blah, blah, blah. He went away with a lot. He got introduced to, all of the principles of all of the clinical trial companies in Australia in one day. Software people live on the internet, and I know LinkedIn's great, Michelle, but a cold call through LinkedIn is nowhere near as powerful as turning up at an industry event and walking the floor.
Definitely a mix. I have a bit of feedback quickly. There's one member of the audience who said, I cannot agree more with the comment on the expensive government grant system.
Yes.
I think that's a big takeaway there. We only have a few minutes left. We've had such a vibrant discussion. I can only quickly now jump to a couple of questions. Can I perhaps ask, or if it's possible, from Carol and Audrey and Natasha, if people can submit questions later on, perhaps, and because there's such wonderful feedback here that really we only have time for maybe 2 questions, if possible. So the one that I wanted to put forward to the panel as an audience question was, what skills are you looking for from those individuals coming from either research or medical students interested? Is there a particular skill set that you feel your industry is lacking? I think, David, I'll throw to you quickly there, because you really identified that the lack of talent, and Michelle, you did too, is something that needs to be bridged. What is the talent you're looking for?
Yeah, so look, as I think we also discussed towards the beginning of our time, it is a multidisciplinary area. So in some ways, all of the skills, right? We're short on all of them, and so interest and hunger, which I think Arthur also identified from one of his comments earlier, to really want to be involved and really want to tackle the problems of healthcare. And there are so many people have brought up rural and regional and making sure services in those areas work. Obviously we've got problems here in Australia around Indigenous health and closing the gap. And but our health system is under pressure. We're very lucky in Australia to have a fabulous health system which is free at the point of care, or at least very accessible at the point of care. And to maintain that, we're going to need to have really smart people coming in and looking at how we how we do enable, continue to be a sustainable health system at the level of funding that we can afford, with and digital technologies and digital health, how that's going to happen. So certainly, so people coming in, it's wonderful to hear so many people coming in to this area from so many different areas, the clinicians and allied health workers, etc., who do come into digital health and look to contribute their knowledge and expertise and really become digital health people. I think it's really important, as well as, of course, getting more STEM scientists to actually take an interest in health and digital health and helping us translate the health system.
Thank you, David. Very quickly, Michelle, any talent that you're looking for, what would you say is your top 3 maybe?
Yep, yeah, top 3 is good. So the first talent I'm looking for is clinical skills. So I think this is a big gap. So in my team at the moment, we've got a lot of people that come from the computer science space, and I really need clinical skills. So if there's any clinicians out there listening today, your language skills and your knowledge of clinical experience is hot property right now. There's a war on talent when it comes to people from the clinical trials sector. So just sort of flagging that if you want to sort of fast track your career, think about that. The big skill that I'm missing in my team that I constantly agonize over is planning and project management skills, learning how to stick to a deadline. And the final one is barista skills, because no one in my team can make a decent coffee. They're out.
Oh, that's gold. That's absolute gold. I'm going to throw the last question today to George and Arthur. And I think this is a really good one for the two of you because you've both touched on it today. What do you think early career researchers or those coming out of their PhDs, masters and honours should be looking for in a mentor? You made a very good point before, George, that it's not about, hey, will you be my mentor? But it's a case of what are we looking for? How do you find that relationship, or is it organic? Is it inorganic? Can you give us your perspective?
How about I go first and Arthur can have the last word?
Yeah, no, George, definitely you go first, and I'll let Arthur come in because I have no doubt there is going to be nuggets of gold from both of you.
Yeah, thank you. It's actually a good question. I don't think there's a blueprint for a mentor. And if I look at the people that I would consider mentors, there's some personal relationship there too. I think you've got to get along, so to speak. Obviously, the person has an understanding of what your career goals are, what you want to do. And I think the ones that have been, I suppose, helpful for me is that I approach them in a way, as sort of the younger person, approach them to ask for advice. I think it was said earlier, ask for advice, ask for their knowledge, because they would have done some things there, or exactly ask the question you just said, like, what career path do you see, or what stumbling blocks did you come across? I think it's more of those open-ended questions. And so if you find that person reciprocates with answers or challenges, then you've probably identified a mentor that's going to be with you for a while, and they give you their time. If you're continuously going to someone and they're not giving you that feedback or not giving you the time of day, they're probably not going to be the mentor that you're looking for. And also, if it's someone that's comes back to you unaided, that's a quality that you think, well, they've got an interest in helping and paying it forward and so forth. And so it's definitely something that's going to be a two-way street. And as I said, as I said earlier, you're not going out to find a mentor. I think if you approach it that way, you're probably not going to find what you're looking for. It's more around that relationship and who that person is. And again, not expecting them to, you shouldn't be expecting them to do everything for you. I mean, they're not there to be your lackey or your boss in a way. So you got to think of it as a two-way street. Arthur?
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with what you said. First and foremost, you're absolutely right, George. It's about a relationship. You've got to be able to get on with this person.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean they're going to be your best buddy.
Correct.
But, you know, often they're not. But you've got to be able to have a communication and an empathy both ways. You're looking for somebody who's got at least a little bit of grey hair and a few cuts and bruises, because they're going to be the most valuable mentor, the one who's actually learned the hard way. You know, so people who think about the experience your mentor has got, because that's what you really want them for, is their experience. And the preparedness to give you the time of day, absolutely, because, you know, now those are sort of competing characteristics, because the really experienced, really senior person doesn't have much time. But, you know, they've got to be prepared to give you at least some, but don't be too demanding. Understand the constraints on the mentor as well. So you've got to be able to learn to understand each other and to get on.
Yeah, it's a two-way street. It's definitely a two-way street. We have reached time. I want to give a warm thank you to Natasha, Arthur, David, Michelle, and George for seriously giving such quality time, not just to the whole hour and a half, but really thoughtful, meaningful answers that I think most of us, I certainly learned things as well, that being in academia for X amount of years that I've not been in industry. I work with industry, but I've not been in it. And to see both sides so clearly through your eyes today has really helped me, and I think many others. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Brad Ridout, to now Dr. Audrey Rowland, and to Carol, who's doing a wonderful job in bringing all this together. And sincerely, I hope everybody is able to stay in contact through, as we've talked about, LinkedIn or social media. And please, thank you again for coming and giving your generous time. And that's a virtual clap, by the way, if you guys didn't know what that is. Yeah, and fist bumps.
And I think we're all on LinkedIn, and I certainly wouldn't object to people pinging the questions.
Absolutely, I'm on LinkedIn, and if anybody's interested in digital mental health, that's my background. But I'm open to learning about anything and everything about the digital world. It fascinates me. And again, thank you all for your time today.
Thank you. Good luck, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Just a quick comment. We're going to leave the Padlet platform open for a few days to let the audience the opportunity to keep asking questions to our panelists. And if the panelists can answer the question on the Padlet, that would be fantastic. We'll send you an email anyway with a link to the Padlet, a link to a post-event survey. And thank you, everyone, also the LinkedIn profile of our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for attending.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Audrey.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.